So Jordan Peterson recently had an appearance in New Zealand where he had a few speaking engagements on his book tour promoting the book 12 Rules for Life, which has subsequently been removed from our largest bookseller, one of our largest booksellers, the Whitcoul's network of stores franchises. And after he left the country, there was a terrorist attack in Christchurch where 50 Muslims were murdered by a white nationalist. And then a photo appeared of Peterson standing with a fan who was wearing a t-shirt saying, "I am a proud Islamophobe," with a series of critiques of Islam, a list of these critiques appearing on the t-shirt as well. And this generated an increased degree of controversy surrounding Peterson, greater perhaps than the amount of controversy which had surrounded him during his time in the country. Although, of course, he didn't receive as much attention because our attention has rightly been on the general problem of Islamophobia, which seems much more pressing. But Peterson's book has been removed from Whitcoul's shelves, and I wanted to talk a little bit about Jordan Peterson and some of the reasons why I find him dangerous. So one of the things that troubles me about Jordan Peterson is the similarity of his rhetoric about so-called postmodern neo-Marxism with the rhetoric of Anders Breivik in his manifesto, where he talks about the rise of cultural Marxism in Western Europe after the end of World War II, when communists and Marxists started spreading throughout Western Europe into institutions of higher learning, universities, and sociology and philosophy, perhaps departments. Anyway, and they started undermining Western morals and the Western moral order and traditions, and started promoting a Marxist way of thinking. And so then the similarity between this and Peterson is striking, because Breivik was talking about multiculturalism, and this is a series of slurs that are common on the white nationalist spectrum, but Peterson instead is talking about a change from traditional Marxist thinking, which pits the bourgeoisie against the proletariat, and instead of this, these postmodern neo-Marxists are now talking about instead of historical materialism seeing this eternal struggle between classes, they're talking about the oppressed versus the oppressor, and instead of it just being an economic kind of oppression, you've got a whole proliferation of different dimensions along which you can define the oppression. That can be about race, anti-black racism, the oppression of minorities by white people. It can be about sexuality, sexual orientation. It can be about gender identification, or just gender, men against women, misogyny, the patriarchy, all this kind of stuff. And he's talking about, you've got a proliferation of categories, which is a problem with trans pronouns and gender identities, but also the fact that you can never redress all of these. So there's a similarity between him and the rhetoric of mass shooters, who in fact inspired the mass shooting in New Zealand. So beyond that, you've got some of Peterson's essentialist accounts. He talks about the difference in IQ scores between the average black and average white individual in the United States, and also other ethnic groups, but he doesn't emphasize that as much. And he's talking about how there's a genetic basis for this, that it can't be denied, that the evidence is overwhelming, and that he's just giving a clear-headed, rational assessment of the unfortunate and regrettable facts. And he doesn't like to say it, but it's just the way it is that black people are inferior effectively to white people. And so that's, he's providing respectable-ish cover. I don't find that view respectable, but I'm saying that in terms of respectability politics with a lot of the rhetoric that he gives, the highly academic prose and the way of speaking, the convoluted way of presenting a position, also the three-piece suits, all that kind of stuff, and his academic gravitas, he is providing respectable cover for white nationalism, perhaps not deliberately, but still there's an alignment of their interests and an alignment of their beliefs, where the belief systems that white nationalists espouse are served greatly by the rhetoric and the propaganda, perhaps, of somebody like Jordan Peterson. So that for me is a problem. And then another thing is when he talks about, another essentialist account is when he's talking about hierarchies in nature. He's talking about the lobster. And so, Kathy Newman, obviously it was a straw man when she said, so you're saying that we should organize our society along the lines of the lobster. That's nonsense, Kathy Newman. I'm sorry, but, try and exercise the principle of charity when you're discussing something with somebody. And Peterson has said he's not justifying hierarchies, he's merely describing them, and he's talking about how there is inevitably going to be a continuity between the natural world, the animal kingdom, and human behavior, because they have the same molecular biological basis. And if you look at evolutionary psychology, it renders a lot of our behaviors that would otherwise seem like sociological constructs essential and biologically rooted. So there's a fundamental basis for them. So that's his account of hierarchies. And then there's one other thing that troubles me, which is when he's talking about how you got to clean your room, put your own house, I think he has said this verbatim, in perfect order before you go on and start trying to attribute the situation that you find yourself into oppression and into societal problems. And how how dare you? Who are you to have the temerity to try and provide advice to society at large, to the entire world, to start talking about how the world should be reconfigured and reorganized along the lines of your ideas when you can't even maintain and manage your own household effectively? So clean your room, you piece of shit. Now, the problems, of course, with this are myriad. One of them is that people who are suffering, who are struggling, who are experiencing deprivation and poverty, they score lower on IQ tests, not because they're dumb and that's why they're in poverty, but because being in poverty and deprivation, it means that they're experiencing a lot of stress, a lot of money troubles, a lot of stuff that's distracting them, and it's lowering the effectiveness of their thinking. Their working memory is taken up, their cognitive bandwidth is drained, it's clogged by all of these extraneous concerns. And then another thing is that there are legitimate problems with our society and legitimate grievances that people have and legitimate societal and structural inefficiencies and injustices that anybody who's capable of rational consideration would be capable of observing, and the ability to observe, criticize and diagnose these things is not dependent on your ability to clean your fucking room. So one of these is trait conscientiousness, and one of these is merely power of observation and analysis, and these are independent abilities. I mean, they're correlated, but still. And it's not even trait conscientiousness. It's not even trait conscientiousness. And it's not trait intelligence either. Like I said, both of these factors, conscientiousness and intelligence, are affected by your ability, by your ability to function in either of these domains is affected by your position in the hierarchy. Which Peterson would acknowledge, but it's also affected by the experience of deprivation that you're having that can inhibit your cognitive functioning. So that is interesting. It strikes me as having similarity to a lot of rhetoric that I've had in discussions with other people. Like, for instance, I had a fundamentalist Christian preacher who was a friend of mine, and he said that if the account of human nature that you find in Genesis wasn't true, if the story of Genesis wasn't true, then it may as well be, because it was the most accurate account of human nature that he had ever come across. If you're talking about original sin, he said, if you are in fact free to do as you want, then try going a week without sinning, without, giving it a shitty urges and shitty impulses. And I said, no fucking problem. But it was difficult. And he says, if you're really free, then it should be equally easy to do good things as it is bad things. But it's much easier to do shitty things. But it's just, good things take effort. Achieving something takes effort. Resisting impulses takes effort. That doesn't mean that I'm under the power of Satan, but still. I think that the problem is that same thing that I was talking about hierarchical impulses. How hierarchy is something that's within us, but it's not given free rein in a state of nature. So we're outside of our environment. We're not in an environment that we're adapted to. And not only that, but we're in an environment that's been built by us by virtue of the fact that we have these burdensomely large neocortices which allow us to process things and conduct all this analytical thought and forward planning and solve all these problems. And so we've constructed an environment which our hindbrain, our midbrain, our lower impulses and instincts are not adapted to. So that's a problem. And not only has it been built by the smartest part of us, but also the smartest members of our species of every generation. And not just the most intelligent, because that seems kind of essentialist, but the best educated, the ones who've had the most opportunities, the ones who have demonstrated the most ability to solve problems and innovate and push things forward. And so the rest of us are condemned to live in an environment which no individual within us can fully understand.